Good afternoon, and welcome to the final edition of the Provost's Conversations on Teaching and Learning. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Tom Bean from the Darden College of Education. He is a professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning, and his area is reading and literacy. And let me say a little bit about his area of research. Dr. Bean's research in content area literacy, adolescent literacy, and disciplinary literacy spans both college reading as well as K through 12 settings. He has taught undergraduate and graduate classes in content area literacy with an emphasis on inquiry and creative problem solving. As well, he holds an endowed professorship in the Darden College of Education, and he has his PhD in secondary education from Arizona State University. So without further ado, Dr. Bean.
Thank you. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here today at our lunch conversation. And we'll be talking about creativity in teaching specific to a course that I'm currently offering in Virginia Beach. So it's called Reading 680, Reading Across the Curriculum. These are students getting a graduate program completed as well as initial teacher licensure. So they come from all the way from kindergarten through high school. And it's a course I've been teaching for quite some time, sometimes called content area literacy and related to disciplinary literacy. So it spans those areas. And it includes students that are taking the class partly to learn about different strategies for vocabulary development in the academic areas, comprehension, critical reading, critical thinking, and study strategies. Those are some of the things we deal with related to our standards of learning here that are also related to the Common Core state standards. So that's a big part of the class, but the other part that occurred to me this semester that might be helpful is to have a central theme that we could work on that represents a lot of what happens in problem-based and project-based learning. So I thought about things that would impact our area and also impact global issues, and climate change came to mind. Since we have an active scientific program on campus related to that, students are well aware of the sea level rise issues here, water pollution, water cleanup, and so on in our waterways and tidewater. So I thought that would be a good thing to work on. So it was one of my brainstorms. I take risks each semester, I think, to sabotage my own teaching through creative efforts to make it more interesting. Sometimes that works out really well, sometimes it blows up on you. So this time it's worked out quite well. So I wanted to share that. And this is a after-class group working in small groups. There's 4 small groups in this course, 15 students. They're in the Virginia Beach campus, where I get to teach periodically, and one of our off-campus sites. So they're collaborating on developing units of instruction specific to climate change issues. That is, causes, multiple effects, and potential solutions that we can work on. I'll tell you a real quick story. This week our dishwasher went on the fritz, so we had to use plastic forks. There's a line in the song you'll see where they talk about not doing that unless they're recyclable, right? So for about 2 days there I was violating our own song that we wrote in class. That's the content book that we use. It has lots of different examples from different disciplines in the sciences, history, mathematics, English, and so on. And lots of different approaches we can work with. So rather than doing those as kind of disjointed approaches, I really wanted us to focus on this issue of climate change. And I wasn't sure how students react to that. As it turns out, they've taken it up with a lot of enthusiasm. We have the Brock Environmental Center locally. One group's working with that site where everything is solar-powered, water-powered, recycled, and so on. We have a number of schools in the community now that are moving into green kinds of issues where they can create a campus that's very much aligned with some of the things we talk about in this particular unit. So in order to do this, we looked at those elements. And then they read from various texts, both online and in print form. I brought articles in. And as they started to move forward with their unit development, and units in this area can span about 6 weeks, so they're fairly in-depth, serious units that ultimately, in a perfect project learning world, would go to stakeholders. That is, we'd go out to the community and present these. For our students at this stage, they're developing units they can use as they move into teaching. And so all the strategies we worked with dealt with climate change kinds of issues. So if we're thinking about technical vocabulary or some of the other things that come up in this book, which is more of a layperson's book, but pretty friendly around climate change. So we drew from that. And then I'm going to touch on a few things about creativity theory. That's a body of research that's pretty extensive, both in Australia, Europe, here, and elsewhere. And then move into the strategy called rewrite. This is something I developed a while back when I was a department chair and professor back in my home state of the Hawaiian Islands. And so we did this initially in a biology class. And then I've just kept that going. So I have songs now about snapping turtles, alligator snapping turtles, bull sharks, you name it. All sorts of kind of science-based, typically, concepts around various creatures and animals and insects and things like that. So it's a little different. The one thing about doing these songs is you end up with polysyllabic words that come out of the text and material they're reading, and it's very different than singing a straight-ahead blues song, which I can do in my sleep or songs I know. I never memorize these, so when you watch the clip at the end, you'll see it gets a little weird at places. In fact, I think I juxtaposed 2 verses and just kept on going at that point. And then my students perform it as well, but I don't have that clip here. So defining creativity. Generally, creativity is thought of as something that's of value and is novel or unique. And we can talk about big C creativity, like the invention of the Macintosh computer, but we can also talk about little c creativity, things we do in teaching, where we're thinking about how can we make this more interesting and engaging, and what can we do to get students into deep comprehension as opposed to shallow surface-level comprehension. So toward that end, Albert Einstein says creativity is intelligence having fun, and it requires some risk-taking. So anytime I go down this road with the songs and so on, I think, gee, it could just go crazy, but it does. So far, it's worked out pretty well. I often have students in class that come from music backgrounds. Mine's pretty informal. I can read chord charts. I took 3 years of piano, didn't like it. I was an elementary-age kid in a suit on Sunday sitting next to a little girl doing a duet. Chopin, Schubert, and so on. I'm sure my mom and dad thought that was a great idea. I couldn't stand it. My brother was a guitar player, so he'd bring his guitar home, and I started to get into the guitar and just left piano completely. And so my music theory is fairly limited to chord charts and YouTube clips and things like that. It's all those other resources. So in any case, we have a lot going on in our area. The Elizabeth River Cleanup Project, lots of waterway efforts to get oysters back in place and to really improve our waterways. So there's a lot for students to think about with respect to their students. It helps when you're doing this to have either a standard or a folk tune or rap or some model that's predictable. And that avoids a lot of classroom management headaches. So if students have a pattern to work with, that really helps. When I have music majors in class, I had a jazz trumpeter in class last semester. He brought his trumpet in and worked with us. I had a really good blues guitar player in my semester here this time. He brought his guitar in, and we worked with that to help students write these verses. So, but again, you don't have to be a musician to do this. You can do this with rap and lots of other forms, poetry and so on. So transmediation is another part of this. That is, you're moving from one semiotic sign system, namely text reading, into music, into film, iMovies, and so on. You're moving into other domains. So you're moving across semiotic sign systems. And that's kind of important, and gives that. And then some advantages of doing work around creativity. Aesthetics would be one. Donald Norman, a wonderful cognitive psychologist, has written a lot about our affective responses to various designs. And so if you have a teacup, for example, or a teapot, and you pour it and the tea goes all over the place, we have an affective response to that, and it's not good, right? It's, I'm not using this thing ever again. And then he argues that certain things make us smile. So a Mini Cooper car that looks kind of cute and interesting might cause us to smile. So we have a positive affective response to design that's well done. So I'm always hoping we come up with these songs that are well done and can make people smile a little bit. Higher order thinking, you're really working with abstract concepts at this point. There's no, apart from the blues structure, there's no other direct pattern. I usually do one verse that I write that's kind of naive knowledge about a topic, so it's not very well informed. And then when students delve into the topic, the verses they write reflect that new knowledge. So then the whole thing falls into place. Tolerance for ambiguity. It's like working on a European motorcycle that might be very old and not have any parts fabricated anymore for it. You've got to figure out how to solve those problems to get the engine to run. And collaboration with others, which is hugely important now. Teachers work in core teams. They're often engaged in trying to work through student problems, and problem-based learning, again, becoming a hugely popular area. So we have schools in our local area that are doing that really quite well with some of our students out there. This is a gift from my wife. And it's a 3-string cigar box guitar made out of a Virginia license plate, or home, and a cigar box. And it has 3 strings tuned to open G tuning, so you can play slide guitar with that. And it has a little Fanta knob off a Fanta soda that is connected, when I wire it in, it's connected to the volume control. Yeah. I can make a lot of noise with that. I did not do that for this talk. Okay. So you need to have a predictable melody or structure to work with, and a 12-bar blues lends itself to that. And then create a verse. So that's the first verse that I did just to get us started, to have a structure to work with. And then as we go along, you'll see the remaining verses that students wrote. And where it has a 2x, that's 2 lines of that, and then a turnaround. And students often have a hard time when we're writing this to realize you need a turnaround. You can't just get stuck. And apparently Mozart used to do that to his family. He would not resolve a note. And that's just crazy, right? So, good way to drive somebody nuts. So 4 groups of students, 1 working on causes, 2 groups that worked on effects, and another group on solutions to climate change. And we collect all those at the end of our writing workshop where we're developing this. I take it home and I put the whole thing together into something coherent. Although it's usually pretty coherent anyway, and it falls into place because each one of those has a category that needs to go in the song in a logical way, starting with causes. And then there's some of the lines, I won't read those to you, but you can see them in terms of some of the verses that students wrote, and their names, basically first names only, are in there. And these are students that, by the way, at the end of all of this, when they're completing their program, they take a comprehensive exam of 4 questions that they write to on a Saturday for about 3 or 4 hours here on campus. So there's a number of assessments they have to go through, including the Virginia Reading Assessment and so on. So there's lots happening. When we're doing this kind of activity, I'm usually using a rubric as a way of evaluating the work, but I also don't want to make them miserable with that either, because they're taking some risks along with me. So, and a few more verses. This is about the Coca-Cola bear, if you've seen that ad. Yeah. And some more text. And then once we get to the point where I can play the song's about 4 minutes. I've been advised I should not be talking during that, and I won't. Go play that clip, and then I want to open it up to questions and so on, and talk about perhaps some of the work we've done with middle school students using this approach. So I can refer to some of that. Okay, so I'm going to go over here and get this moving. Once I find my cursor. It'll take a minute to load up, and then we'll put it on large screen. This is our messy office at home.
Tell Coca-Cola bear his claim is his. Tempers are rising, things are slowly down. Yeah, tempers are rising, things are slowly down. What can we do if the CO2 rises? Gotta find solutions to climate change issues. Gotta find solutions to climate change issues. Stop recycling your paper and tissue. How about moving closer? No, we're using those plastic forks. How about moving closer? We're using. Make a change in this world, you gotta know. I got climate change. Too much carbon everything we use. I got climate change. Yeah, there's too much carbon everything. I ride my bike and spread the news. We gotta stop these darn climate change blues.
Welcome to Sing Along. Sometimes students do that. Okay, now let me just get out of this beastie for us so we can get to the last part here. Questions? So that's always risky, right? And I'm always happy when it turns out and the darn thing works. And yeah, so, but again, you can use other forms of music, poetry, slam poetry, and lots of other directions to go in. You can also find a musician that will do the background tracks and all of that as well. Any questions at all? And with the respect to questions, there's a... Allison has the mic, and when you get the mic, please don't tap on it to see if it's working. And I've been told there's a number of things that we shouldn't do, and that was one of them. Thank you.
I'm just curious what kind of feedback your students give throughout the class, at the end of class, about using this creative and maybe uncomfortable approach for some students.
Because most of them become aware, I think partly through other classes they take in our program, of multimodal text sets and different ways of students learning now, I think they're pretty tuned into the idea that in their units, and plus I push them in that direction, they need to be thinking about alternative texts as well as, not workaround texts. I don't mean not doing close reading and not doing deep reading, but augmenting that with all these other resources that we have. So generally pretty positive. There's some students probably that are going to say, you know, I'm not a musician, I can't do that or something. But by and large, when I look at their units, and again, I'll be able to answer your question better after the next couple of weeks as they wrap up. Next week, we present things together. They finalize their units. So all that's to say, pretty positive, I think. This has been a pretty enthusiastic group. I teach an undergraduate version of the class, and that's also a bit more challenging. They're coming from multiple disciplines, and I push them out of their disciplinary silos. Sometimes that's uncomfortable, and they don't necessarily think that's a neat idea. If you're an artist, you want to be another artist, and so on. But I'm trying to get them to think about collaborating on big problems. And that's really what project-based learning is all about. It's asking big questions, and there's lots of YouTube clips on that now, too. And our area is a good leader in that, I think, in what we're doing. So I wish I could give you a more concrete answer. Some students love it. Some students probably quietly don't like it and don't tell me that necessarily, but they probably could. Pretty thick-skinned about this.
What else have you done besides music?
Well, I can tell you that we did a project with a middle school that was in a period called a global period, where students read human rights issues. They learned the 14 human rights, which is a little unusual here, and not here at ODU, but in some settings. This was in the Southwest. And those students then read graphic novels around that. And then they took up Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind tune and developed a collage that had 4 panels. 4 groups developed that. And the collage consisted of each of the elements of Blowin' in the Wind, which is actually a children's book now, too. So it's there's an illustrator working with Bob Dylan on it, and the song is in there. So I play that song, so I played the song. And then that we developed in that class, really not answering your question very well, because we developed a human rights blues in a very noisy school where we had to go out to my car, flip the tailgate up, and record everything with a laptop out in the street. So there's motorcycle sounds going by and so on, but that's quieter than the school site where we were doing this. So, and some of those students would write poetry and do other forms of creative work. I think anytime you engage in creative work, though, you're in this kind of mystical, ethereal world where you've got to start shaping things that may not necessarily go together. For example, we have a Tibetan Terrier dog that eats plastic. Plastic's bad news, right? Because it doesn't recycle well at all. So I use it to make collages and art. It's pretty bad art, frankly. I was an art major at one point, briefly. I did toxic art with resin and surfboard materials. But I do these collages where I'm recycling and repurposing that stuff. I do wind chimes and things like that, too. So there's a lot of different ways to go, but a collage is a logical thing to do. And we started that project, it was a year-long project with middle school students doing these collages. And then that moved into their developing an iMovie on deportation and immigration issues. And many of these students had families that were, at peril in some of that. I hope I've answered that a little bit anyway. So we've carried it out with students in real schools and sites beyond. I mean, our students are already going into teaching. They're enthused. They're excited. That's a pretty easy group to work with.
I have a question. I'm just curious. Have you been doing this long enough that some of the students you taught are coming back and saying, this is what I did with my students?
Yeah, since 1997. So,
wow.
Yeah. That's probably about 200 songs at this point that I don't quite know what to do with, but they're all there.
And
that's from teaching the course for a long time.
Who have come out of the program say, this is what I did with my 5th graders?
Sometimes,
yeah.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Travis Bowman, one of our elementary teachers now, is a really fine guitar player, and yeah, we have folks that could, I suppose, give a testimony to this. But yeah, and again, it's up against all the standards and all the things that we do that we have to meet, so our students can pass their comprehensive exam, they can pass their assessments in the state, and be licensed. So it's not that that's going somewhere else, but I think project-based learning like this and other programs that we've had in the Provost Talk. 2 weeks ago, we had one that dealt with the business school and what they were doing with real live businesses, helping them out, marketing plans, and so on. I think those kinds of things are hugely powerful. And those are the things you remember as a student, right? We can all remember the teachers that got us engaged in something that seemed to have an impact on the community, on social justice, on our lives. So, yeah. Other questions that I can respond to? So do you want to sing the song again?
Oh, okay. There's a rule that says I can never be on the right side.
I know, sorry. So there's a lot going on here, right? Can
Yes.
you talk about assessment and what you assess and how you assess?
Well, in the course, because they're doing, the major focus is developing this longer unit. So I'm looking at that in detail. With this, I'm generally moving around the room a lot, and if they're writing verses that don't connect and are not going to be coherent, then that's one aspect that we try and solve right there. So I'm moving around constantly with the small groups, and our other guitar player, William, was able to do that as well. So I'm not sure that's a great assessment, but it's a way of helping writing in action. So it's reflection in action, really. So I try and do that. But the major assessment is around the unit plan that they develop. And they turn that in midterm and then again at the end. And I give them points in a feedback loop at the beginning, or at the midterm rather, and then at the end again. But our students are pretty far along. They know they're professionals. Many of them are actually out tutoring in AVID programs that have been around for a long time, where they're helping students think about going to college, particularly middle and secondary. And they're often working with students as tutors, so they already have a lot of experience. And they range in age from mature returning students to students who are quite a bit younger in their early career. So it's a real mix. I love teaching that class for that reason, partly because I get to see a lot of elementary folks as well. And they'll do units typically around plants and things like that. But this time around, they're looking at water issues, water quality, and on and on. Is that helpful? I don't know if I've totally answered that. And again, I've been doing that for a long time, so it's pretty automatic. You get to a point in guitar playing where you don't have to look at your fingers.
Sometimes when you add creativity to a lesson or to a unit, it's sometimes hard to assess that,
Yes.
right? And so that's,
Sure.
I guess maybe that's part of what I'm asking too, is how do you assess the creativity? And sometimes it gets to be so much about the creativity and the
Yeah.
product, and not necessarily about the content that you want them to walk away with. And
Yeah, that's one of the
address that
risks,
challenge?
certainly. That's an absolute risk. And, the problem with our field of reading is we could spend a lot of time on minutia related to decoding and so on, and some of that's very important and does happen in other classes. This class is really devoted toward academic vocabulary, disciplinary issues, analogical reasoning, and other things that are a bit beyond what we'd worry about at phonemic awareness stage or phonics stage or decoding stages. So those things are technical. They're elements of what we think about. We do look at the upside and downside of readability and reading difficulty. So with different kinds of texts they're working with. So those are kind of mathematical things you can assess, realizing there's flaws in that system. So yeah, it's a good question. And it's a tough spot, and I probably don't do that as well as I could. It'd probably be good to bring somebody else in to look at the creative part. I just get excited when the whole thing falls into place and starts to work, and they start to see there's value in doing this as part of a multimodal text set. I can use music, I can use poetry, I can use film. And I do a fair number of things around guide material that's looking at different video clips, YouTube clips, comics sometimes. We look at the New York ballerina Copeland, I think that's, yeah. We look at her clip and how she was treated as a student and then critique that. So when I'm thinking about critical thinking and critical reading and critical literacy, we're coming at it from the standpoint of you can take apart and deconstruct a video clip that may be portraying something that's really ridiculous. And she overcame a lot of obstacles to get to where she is. Misty Copeland, there we go. Yeah, so we'll look at her work. Shamika Copeland, Johnny Copeland's daughter, who's a fantastic early 30s blues singer, has won all kinds of awards, gone to Washington, D.C., been recognized. She does political blues, so she raises the roof around that. Bernard Allison, there's so many people. So my influences in blues come out of Jimmy Reed, way back, Louisiana blues guy who was fantastic, and sitting in front of a high-fidelity player and learning to play that music. So it's pretty self-taught in terms of that and the harmonica. But you don't have to do that, right? It's okay. Other questions?
Can I just share? I'm the mother of a fourth grade teacher in D.C. who shares a lot of fun things with me, like, this is the book we're reading, Mom, would you read it? And a recent one was called Al Capone Does My Shirts, about a kid who grew up on Alcatraz Island. And her librarian last week, there's a sibling who is autistic and needs buttons, plays with buttons always in a box. Very important that this button box be with the child at all times. And last week, her class went to the library and they made button boxes. So that's the kind of thing that they're always going to remember the day they made the button box, so they'll remember the book, and I love this kind of project stuff.
We look at clips that are in Australia as well as the U.S. and elsewhere where project-based learning is alive and well, and students are often studying kids in their own classrooms. So one of the clips is here in Newport News, actually, and that group of students realized one of their colleagues, one of their classmates had, I want to say cystic fibrosis, but something like that. That's probably not the right diagnosis. But in any case, they started researching that to figure out how can we help our friend here. So it's really on the ground kind of work. And again, that tends to be what we actually remember. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Sure.
Coming at you.
Yeah, he. These are all my colleagues over here clustered. My department chair, colleague in PhD, GPD.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and I have this quick question. Looks like this project is really interdisciplinary.
Yes.
And I wondered if what was the students' responses who consider might be teaching in high school or higher grade in the middle school. Did you get the same response from students?
Not necessarily. In the undergrad class, we had a good trumpet player, and we had lots of folks writing things. But I think there's probably part of that class last semester that would say, I'd really rather hang out with my other history friends or their art friends, my music friends, and I sort of force them into these interdisciplinary zones. And I don't know if I would continue to do that. I'd have to wrestle with that. That's my belief system overriding something that may be not good to override. So it may be better to have them clustered within their disciplines, although I really love interdisciplinary work. And I think a lot of problems are being solved now, certainly at our level in academia, that involve multiple ideas, multiple approaches. So it's a conundrum. I don't have an easy answer for that, unfortunately.
Do you think the high school students need more experience like that, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I would probably lean more in that direction now than I did the last semester when I was teaching that particular undergrad class, content literacy. Content literacy, of course, is now part of the ongoing debate about should we focus on disciplinary literacy issues like sourcing in history, for example, or generic strategies. So there's this ongoing discussion and debate around that. And we're not far enough along in the disciplinary literacy research yet to say, yes, that's somehow exactly what we should be doing, but it's an issue that spans, I've just been a couple days reading for Handbook of Research a community college series of articles where they're looking at community college developmental reading courses and finding at the level, getting off a sidetrack here a little bit, but the level of reading material that students are reading is around 12th grade or less. Typically the range is 6th to 9th grade. Yet when they go into general education classes, what would the level be? Well beyond 12th grade. So there's a disparity, right, in the research that's looking at that in detail. And they look at readability of text, they look at faculty responses and perceptions. Faculty in the disciplines generally want students to be reading independently, coming into those courses, and they're not collaborating across those zones, so we have these silos. So it's pretty powerful work that we're recounting a book chapter done by some folks in Northern Illinois University and elsewhere. So lots of issues right now in the field of literacy. We can probably do better than we are currently doing. So we're trying.
My question is built on Young He's actually, Tom, because I would encourage you to challenge breaking down the silos and the disciplines, because I think you're absolutely right. Our problem-based, project-based learning is a way that we're going to influence our communities, our civilization, the whole business. We have to work together. So the idea of being able to take the middle or the secondary folks, breaking down the barriers, having them work together on the projects, I think is a good idea. That's actually what I was going to ask about.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm excited about that as well, and it takes some risk to do that, and probably some of those result in responses where students feel like, gee, stuck us in these groups of people that you're not in the same field. So, yeah, I understand that.
This is very bold, what you're doing. I have a different question. Can you share an example of a creative endeavor you tried that you simply wouldn't do again?
Well, I used to do toxic resin paintings, but I don't do that anymore. They're cancerous and so on. Gee, I have to think about things that have bombed now.
I know we never want to remember those anymore.
Well, yeah, I suppose. Back when I was an English major student, I had a professor named Phyllis Thompson who was a wonderful poet, and she got an NEH grant to do poets in the schools. And part of that grant involved us going out to school sites and enticing kids, often middle school kids. Typically the girls would come to the sessions, boys, no poetry at that point in time. And so those things went moderately well. But the other part of that is we had to go to Phyllis's, back in the day when you could go to a professor's house and you had to take your poetry in, along with hers. And she'd have us critique her poetry. We had to read our poetry aloud. I've had lots of those bomb. Yeah. She served wine, though, so you got your courage up and then you read your poem. So it's an interesting era. But I can't think of a lot of, gee, have I bombed musically? Probably. I don't know. But you're really thinking about teaching strategies, teaching approaches that have bombed. Oh, I honestly can't. I'd love to find one, but I have a pretty positive view of the world, so I tend not to think too negatively. If I think of one, though, Charles, I'll be happy to share it.
Other questions?
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.